Hello, excellent people. I'm Charles Beatty. This is Aim at Excellence. Today I'm going to take a break from our structured process that we've been working on, and I'm just going to share some thoughts on a topic that I find of interest. This will be a bit more reminiscent of when I was doing that daily excellence. But the topic of interest today is martial arts, and specifically the ages-old argument of application versus aesthetics, we could call it. I'm going to draw specific lines that I want you to kind of wrap your head around, and then we'll use those lines for the argument for today. But imagine you have martial arts, right? And you have this compound concept of martial and art. And in essence, those two things are questionably compatible, right? So martial is all about war and violence and doing damage and combat. And art is about beauty and expression, creativity. It might be about community as well. There's a lot of layers to both of these ideas, but there's a really interesting sort of dynamic tension between martial and art. And so the continuum that we're working with today is in the broad idea of martial arts. You have on the one side of the continuum, you have truly martial, application forward, basically looking at what is the most effective means of doing combat, versus the other side of the spectrum, which is the art side of the spectrum, which is application or applicability, I should say, is not relevant, and instead it's all about the art. This is really sort of more along the lines of dance, for example, where it's all about the movement, it's all about the expressiveness, it's all about the composition. And there's a third thing that sits in the middle somewhere, probably a little bit biased this way, but it depends on the parameters, which is sport. And as a martial artist for many years now, and as a person who has dabbled in a variety of martial arts, I have mentioned before that my primary skill set lies in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, but even within Jiu-Jitsu, I have a broader exposure to a number of different subsets of grappling than just Jiu-Jitsu. And then outside of Jiu-Jitsu, I have some exposure to some of the internal Chinese martial arts. You've got the Tai Chi and the Xingyi and the Bagua. I've got some exposure to just some really generic MMA, kickboxing, and then I've got some exposure to some fairly traditional karate forms. And each of these fits in a different location on this continuum because of the aim of the people who practice it. So just to further elaborate on these things a little bit, to give some examples, on the far martial end, we have there aren't any rules because it's all about the fight. And really, tactically, strategically, on this far end, it's all about maximum damage to your opponent in a minimum amount of time in order to preserve yourself, because there's an important acknowledgement that's being made when you're actually fighting, which is that the longer the fight lasts, the more likely you are to become damaged in that fight. And there's a second thing in a fight, which is when you are in a fight, the goal is not to win, the goal is simply to not lose, because in a real fight, in a violent altercation where someone is accosting you, or let's say you're in battle in an actual war zone, losing means dying, or losing means being crippled or maimed or whatever. Winning is no longer the goal. All that matters is not losing, okay? So you have to, as quickly as possible, inflict maximum damage in order to extract yourself from the situation. So you have martial arts like that. Well, actually, frankly, I think these folks don't even call themselves martial arts. I think that's part of the key too, is that the term martial arts starts to get ill used when you talk about things like, say, military combatives programs. You know, there's Army combatives in America. There's the MCMAT, which is the Marine Corps martial arts. You've got stuff like Krav Maga, which has become fairly popular in recent years. You've got some of the really traditional forms of karate. So, like the guys that I used to train with were very into this notion of like ending the fight in 3 seconds or less, right? And it really was. It was that maximum damage in a minimum amount of time. And that's what they were after. So, those kinds of situations, it's all about. And then actually, there's another aspect over here, which is weapons. And, you know, I actually have little to no weapons training. But then you can even think about, say, guns, like firearms. So in America, firearms are a big deal. There's lots and lots of folks who carry. I am often amazed by how many people who carry and don't practice with their firearms. Because I personally don't carry. I have no issue with carrying, but I'm not willing to carry without being intimately familiar with my firearm, because as soon as my firearm is in the game has been escalated to a level that the consequences are very, very severe. And I don't want to deal with the emotional burden of making decisions at that level of consequence without having the requisite skills to manage that situation. And so, like, for example, if I have a firearm, well, I want to be able to fire accurately, but I also want to be able to handle the weapon accurately. So, like, I personally wouldn't want to carry a firearm if I wasn't consciously working on how to basically avoid being disarmed. That's probably the first skill set that I'd want to emphasize. Is I want to know that when I draw my firearm, I stay in control of my firearm. And I think that that's something that, I don't know, it seems to not be emphasized by others to the degree that I would emphasize it if I were carrying. I think that's almost more important than being an accurate shooter. Because if I'm firing on someone with a pistol, that I'm assuming they're in, you know, the same room as me, which means they're pretty close to me. Like, I mean, how many times are people firing pistols in streets in America? And I don't know, maybe in air, and let's take gang violence out of the situation. Let's take this more into like your random self-defense circumstance. It seems to me that if you think about what circumstances you're actually preparing yourself for, if I pull my firearm and the person's in the same room as me, I have a very real risk of that person getting close to me before I put them on the ground. Or that's the other thing, that's part of the reason I don't carry a firearm, is because I don't know that I'm emotionally prepared to kill somebody just because they're threatening me. I would rather use my voice and negotiate and even run the risk of personally being injured because I didn't have a nuclear option available to me. Now, let me draw attention to one important fact. I don't have children. If I had children, I might feel differently. I think that a lot of people justify the attitudes that I'm describing because they have families to protect. And there's an acknowledgement that there are dangerous, predatory people in this world who will abuse you and will abuse your family. And you have a responsibility as the family person to protect those under your umbrella. And children cannot protect themselves from fully fledged adults. You know, I saw The Three Ninjas when I was a kid, and I enjoyed the hell out of that movie. But it's unbelievably unrealistic to see a bunch of, you know, an 8, a 12, and a 16-year-old running around just kicking the crap out of adult men, even like marginally trained adult men. I'm sorry, you're not gonna kick the crap out of me as an 8-year-old. It's just not gonna happen. So that's, you know, a little bit of humorous pop culture there. But so that's a little bit of an elaboration upon what I mean when I'm talking about this far end of the spectrum, where it's about survival, really, truly. That's what it's about. So at that level, at that end of the martial spectrum, it's all about survival. And it's all about very short-term decision making to ensure your own survival, which is what I mean when I say not losing. Not losing is surviving. Winning is irrelevant here. Winning belongs in sport. And so let's go ahead and move down to sport, because sport is the area that I personally am most actively enmeshed in, which is Jiu-jitsu is really very sport-oriented, and there is an exception to this. There are clubs in this country, there are clubs in Brazil, there are clubs all over the world where jiu-jitsu is used in a more self-defense context, where they set up scenarios in which it's, you're using your jiu-jitsu for self-defense. But I find in my experience that those are uncommon, for one, and then I'm going to go ahead and throw out the major flaw that jiu-jitsu has with regard to self-defense, which is jiu-jitsu is extraordinarily one-on-one oriented. All of the massively effective jiu-jitsu skills are one-on-one oriented. And so I win often in a fashion that has me so tangled up in my opponent that I literally, when they tap, I will have to say, okay, I hear you. Give me just a sec to literally grab my own leg and move it from where I put it, where it was wrapped around your neck, so tightly and so interwoven that I can't even extract myself smoothly without using my hands, right? And that's not effective in a self-defense circumstance, because I've seen the videos and I've heard the arguments from people who are more qualified than me, but the short version is you're rarely defending yourself against a single attacker, right? In some significant majority of self-defense circumstances, it's multiple attackers, or it's a sucker punch. Don't forget that as well. Having the best jiu-jitsu guard imaginable is irrelevant if someone hits you in the back of the head with a baseball bat. So that's making an argument for something that I didn't mention earlier, which I think is very important, which is situational awareness and decision making that precludes the need for a martial art. But that's a different day, it's a different story. And this is all really just sort of me sharing a thought process and trying to inspire some conversation, because now I'm talking about sport. Well, sport is, we had some guys at my jiu-jitsu club who recently competed. I was one of them. And one of the things I told some of the younger guys, some of the guys who had not competed before, I was like, look, this is not a fight. You need to realize this is a game, and there are rules. And the better that you can play within the realm of the rules, the more successful you will be at the game. Assuming that your intention by competing is to win. They may have a different purpose in competing. I mentioned in a previous video that when I most recently competed, winning was not my top priority. Competing with composure and poise was my top priority. And then, I ended up going 2-5 total, and I was a little bit disappointed with how many matches I lost. And then I kind of had to, check myself and be like, look, man, your goal was not to win. You didn't train as though your goal was to win. I wasn't in the gym every day practicing, drilling, focusing on tournament-specific stuff. I was mostly just in the gym with a little bit of a shift in my mind, but not a significant shift. And that's what it takes when you're serious about something. It takes that level of focus. But it's still a game. There are rules, there are expectations. One of the major expectations in a sport, martial art, is I expect you to stop when I tap. When I submit, I expect you to not break my leg, break my arm, or strangle me unconscious. So that makes it a game automatically. We have this, we have sort of a culture where you slap hands and bump fists right before you go. You got a timer going in the gym. It's a 5-minute timer. You're standing, you're sitting, you're whatever. You say hello to the person, you shake their hand, you ask them how their day was, you have a little bit of formalities, and then you slap hands, bump fists, and go. Well, that slap hand, bump fist, that's a contract. You're literally engaging in a contractual interaction with that person where I slap and bump, and that slap and bump tells you that I know this is a game. And when you slap and bump back, I know that you're playing a game. And if you don't have the slap and bump, then we're talking about something a little bit different. But that's kind of the point that I'm making here, is that that's what makes it sport. There are rules, there are limits placed on it, there's a mat. The mat technically is there for safety of training. It's a training aid, but at some point it actually becomes the playing field. It becomes, we wouldn't do what we do if we didn't have a mat. Like, for example, when we talk about jiu-jitsu guard and the being on your back, there's a whole slew of movements that I use in my jiu-jitsu that I would not do if I was in the concrete. it would hurt too much. It would be painfully, I would be unwilling to make those movements because the effectiveness of them would be buffered significantly by the discomfort that I would feel in the doing. And I wouldn't use them. I would use a very truncated version of my jujitsu out in the world. And that's once again where we take jujitsu from sport back in this direction to being a more applicable martial survival skill. Well, it's going to be a very different looking jujitsu. I mean, a great example of this too is MMA. Anybody who's ever watched MMA, there are a number of very successful jiu-jitsu athletes who then transition to MMA or who have cross-trained throughout their entire MMA career, but their jiu-jitsu is truncated. It's a much simpler version of jiu-jitsu because A, there are lots of things that I do that are very aggressive and very effective that are completely negated by the fact that you can hit me in the head. If you can punch me in the head, all the things that I'm doing change because I have to defend my head. Because if I just attack you in a way that lets you just punch me in the head constantly, well then my attacks are irrelevant. Another thing also with MMA are the gloves. So if you haven't worn them, you don't know. Even the low profile MMA gloves are still quite a lot bulkier than a naked hand. And you can't grip quite as cleanly. You can't move your hand through small spaces, right? So if I have my hand up and under your arm, you can actually pin my hand in a way that limits my mobility because my glove is stuck under your arm. There's all these things, and this is what I'm talking about when I talk about sport and game. There are parameters that are put in place that take this from the survival realm from earlier into the winning realm. So now our goal is, in fact, to win the game, to win the match, to win the submission, to win the moment, whatever. Hell, to win the position so that you can progress your strategy, right? Versus our goal here was survive and inflict maximum damage in minimum time in order to escape the circumstance. Versus, I just mentioned, we might have a 5-minute timer going. Heck, I play a game very consciously where I will actually play very, very loosely and just relaxed and flow and kind of see where it goes for about the first 4.5 minutes. And then that 30 seconds goes and I turn up the heat and I'm like, all right, I got 30 seconds to win, right? I have spent 4.5 minutes just sort of exploring and now I got 30 seconds to win. And that's a consequence, that's a totally different mental space than I'm under attack, I've got to get out of here. Still falls under this umbrella of martial arts. Once again, curiosity, right? This is, I'm not necessarily trying to make some strong case. I'm mostly just exploring an idea that I think is of interest. So let's go ahead and keep shifting down the line to the art side, because I already started alluding to some of this when I was talking about how I play my jiu-jitsu, but let's go ahead and paint a really, really clear picture. I mentioned dance a minute ago. The body mechanics and footwork of dance, whether it's partner dance like ballroom or whether it's individual dance like, say, ballet or something else, modern, there's a lot of similarities between dance and the most artsy versions of martial arts, because at that point it becomes about creative expression, or it becomes a formulaic expression, but it's about the aesthetics. It's about the look and the feel and the evocation of emotion, much more so than it's about the applicability of this skill set in a sporting or a survival context. Two or three examples come to mind. There was a period in American cinema, maybe in the early 2000s, when a bunch of the wushu Chinese martial arts films were really popular, stuff like Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, and there was a Jet Li movie called Hero, I think, and they had these really dramatic choreographed fight scenes that were unreal. Like, these people had these big, beautiful, aesthetically interesting movements, and then they could kind of like almost fly. It was not really flying so much, it was like jumping in a way that it's totally impossible, like Peter Pan style, right? And those movies are an outgrowth of what apparently is actually a thing in China, which is wushu as a aesthetic, dramatized martial art, where you have these people doing these really beautiful, impressive, choreographed sequences, often with sort of complicit partners as opponents. And it's awesome. I mean, I've seen some of this stuff and it's like, whoa, that's intense. And you think to yourself, if a person can do that, they probably also are deadly, which I think in at least some circumstances, if not most of those circumstances, it's true. But if you took that wushu style and you put them in a ring with a heavyweight boxer, I mean, all the heavyweight boxers do is hit them once, and you can spin yourself around all you like, but if they land that hit, you're in trouble, right? So there's a little bit of, and I'm making this sort of classic fallacy of comparing style versus style, but I'm trying to emphasize a point about what these people are trying to accomplish with these specific subsets of martial arts as a whole. So the another thing that comes to mind is I've got a friend who does some taekwondo, and he does some competition with his taekwondo, and he has emphasized to me that for him it's all about the aesthetics. So his taekwondo at this stage in his development with the martial art is when he competes, he's doing a sequence of forms or a sequence of or a known form, or he creates his own form. There's a couple of different contexts in which he does this, but it's always about, can I do this the most smoothly? Like, his aim is to be smooth and beautiful. It needs to be well grounded through his body. His movements need to be fluid. The transitions need to be good. There's all these qualities. And if you think about it, many of these qualities can then be taken and applied elsewhere. Like, if I have the solid foundation in my legs to be able to do dramatic flowing movements with clean transitions, then the assumption is if you were to attack me and I had to move out of the way of your attack, I should be able to do so with poise. And I think that that's accurate, but the way that they train and the way that the things that they value and emphasize are more about the aesthetics than they are about the applications, either in sporting or survival. And then there's a third thing that kind of fits into the aesthetics, but it's almost like almost a separate conversation, which we think about stuff like the Qigong stuff that also comes out of China. I think that there's some stuff, Qigong is almost more like yoga, I guess, which also has an aesthetic component. The Qigong, it's energy work, it's breathing work, it's a standing, moving meditation, right? And these kinds of things fit, in my mind, under the broad umbrella of martial arts, and they definitely fit along the continuum towards the aesthetic, but then they actually have their own category somewhere else because they're all about health, right? It's sort of health promoting martial arts. It's not martial arts with the goal of survival or sport. It's not even martial arts with the goal of beauty. It's martial arts with the goal of connecting to yourself in a way that promotes your health, whether that's mobilizing your joints, whether that's exercising your lungs, whether that's contributing positively to the flow of energy through your body and blood through your body. I think there's an interesting thing hidden in this, which is the source code of your body's movement, right? I think this is something that's super cool to me. You have the joints that have the ability to move, right? So right here, I'm making a circle here, and the movement's coming at my elbow. I can lift my shoulder. I can do here. And you've got all this movement that these systems that are a bit more health oriented will make you go through these movements. And the movements themselves are the foundational, not yet meaning imparted movements of your body. So it's basically like saying, my elbow can move all the way here and all the way here. And there's also, you can see there's some shoulder movement. So I've got elbow down, elbow, or wrist, hand up, hand down, right? And these movements, this is some basics. These are like some of the basics in some of the traditional forms of karate. Is kind of stuff I'm showing right here. This, and this. These are the receiving forms or the receiving patterns in a traditional karate. But the cool thing to me about these from a foundational level is this is running my body through its range of motion. And from the health giving aspect of things, it's mobilizing my joints and it's programming the nervous system pathways that if you're going to flinch reflex, flinch like this, right? Flinch in a way that protects you. Don't flinch like this, which makes you exposed. Flinch like this, which makes you protected. And if you do this over and over and over again every day for 10 years, and then you become startled by anything out in the world, you are not going to do this. You're not going to do it. Your body has literally reprogrammed itself that its foundational movement is this. Its foundational movement is this. Its foundational movement is this, not something that's tactically unsound. And so, like I said, we're kind of in this really broad realm of the aesthetic martial arts, of the artistic martial arts. And so I want to bring this back to my own experience again, because I've kind of gone out in the weeds a little bit and just sort of talked about the variety of things that exist. I personally see my jiu-jitsu as shifted this way towards the artistic rather than shifted this way towards the survival, right? I said earlier that jiu-jitsu in my mind is sporting, and you could take jiu-jitsu and make it more survival oriented, but you can also take it and make it more aesthetic oriented. And the reason I say that's how mine is because there's a creativity component. And when you go in and you say that your goal is not necessarily first and foremost to win, but it is something else, there's an opportunity there for that something else to be filled in a more artistic fashion. So, for example, I personally say this regularly to my training partners that I am all about the movement. Movement is the movement that we create is more important to me than who wins and loses. And if I explore a novel movement pattern and get the joy and the wonder and the fun of doing so, and in so doing make a tactically unwise decision that results in you beating me, cool, no big deal. Slap hands, bump fists, go again. You know what I'm probably going to do is I'm probably going to go back there again, maybe not right away, but at some point, and I'm going to say, what can I do to take that novel movement pattern and still hold the tactical relevance in my mind as well? Can I explore this movement pattern and can I reframe how I'm using it so that I don't lose the tactical relevance in the process? And sometimes the answer is yes, and sometimes the answer is no. But that creativity, that exploration, that for me, that's one of the most beneficial aspects of what I experience in my relationship with martial arts. It's much more rewarding for me than winning and losing. But this is where I'm describing my personal reasoning. Like I mentioned this before in my video that I made after the tournament, where it's like, what I get out of this is not necessarily what others get out of this. And occasionally I get caught up in the momentum of the win and lose, but more often than not, day in, day out, that's not what I'm there for. And I guess my goal in sharing all of this has been, at least in reasonable part, just to show people who either are plugged into the martial arts or aren't, all of the myriad options that are available to them. Because I think that there's this classic red herring, if you will. It's a misleading path of people want to know what's the best martial art. What's like, well, what are you wanting to get out of it? What's the best is a loaded question, because if you define best as what's the most challenging sport, okay, well, wrestling in a broad sense is probably going to be my answer. If your question is what's the best for survival, something that's going to allow you to end the circumstance with maximum force and minimum time and get out of there is the best choice. If your goal is health, well, jiu-jitsu is not that good for us. Like, we hurt ourselves a lot, actually. Jiu-jitsu is really tough on our bodies. And so probably not jiu-jitsu, right? Maybe something like yoga, maybe something like qigong, maybe something like tai chi. If it's aesthetics, and you're just, then I would say I would look to something more gymnastic, something like the wushu stuff. And so what's the best is just depends on you, the person. And so that's why I'm taking the time now to share with you how this fits for me, in hopes that if you have any questions about this, if you're considering this, or if you already have a relationship with this and your relationship is lacking, perhaps you can take this and you can say, oh, you know what? Now that he mentions it this way, if I reframe my reference just a little bit, I can have better results. So that would be my hope for you, is that you can take this and you can apply it in your own life and make your own life more excellent.